Welcome to the channel in my beginner's guide to VBA part 3 covering loops. Before we get into the video, please hit the subscribe and like buttons as they help out a bunch and will help me spend a lot more time trying to create quality content as my channel grows. And feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions on the video or want me to explain anything further. And let's get right into the video. The first loop I'll be covering is the for next loop, which is used to repeat a block of statements a specific number of times. In for loops, we'll use a counter variable whose value is increased or decreased with each repetition of the loop. And to break down this for next statement, let's take a look at a block of code. So the for I equals 1 to 100 is the counter variable. So we're declaring that for I, and you could change that to any name, but normally you choose a one-character name as it's easy to put into that statement later on, equals 1 to 100. So that will be our counter variable that is increasing from 1 to 100. And so if we take a look at the next line, cells I, comma 1, the I will stand for the rows, comma 1, and then the value of that also being I. So as we're incrementing and iterating through 1 to 100, we're also going from cells in column 1 or column A, but through 100 rows, and also giving the same value as the number of row we're on. And then next is what is actually running the 1, and then next 2, next 3, all the way to 100 and stopping on 100. And so if we run this sub by either pressing execute or just hitting F5, we can take a look in Excel and see that it iterated from rows 1 in column 1 or column A to 100 and added that value, being that dot value equals I, into each one. So now we can see how the for loop iterates through this variable and will end at that counter variable, the end that we put to it. And so now to go a little further with this idea of the for next loop, let's take a look at another block of code. So for this block of code, we have the initial for I equals 1 to 100, but then we nested another for loop within this for loop. So we want I to equal 1 to 100 as our counter variable, and then we have another for within our for I. We're letting for m equal 1 to 50. So we have another counter variable. And a good way to think of this will be if we look right under the for m equals 1 to 50, cells I, so the rows will be 1 to 100 and equal I, and now the columns will be from columns 1 to 50 in the counter variable m, and the value will still equal I. So we'll go from rows 1 to 100 and also from column 1 to 50, and putting values in there 1 through 100 in all of those columns. We also nested an if. So if the cells have a value greater than 50, then using the property of those cells to change the color index to 3, which will be red, and then ending the if, and then the next m, so iterating through m, and then outside of that inner loop be the outer loop, which will be next I, which will then loop through the counter variable I. So we have a nested for and a nested if. And this will be vital to creating more complex macros and loops that go off of each other and are nested within. But so if we run this by either pressing F5 or clicking on the execute button or the run sub, we can take a look in Excel and see that it did indeed go from rows 1 to 100 and also columns 1 to 50, and for any value greater than 50 did create a red color as the background color for those cells. With now understanding how to use counter variables, how to nest loops and other statements such as ifs, we can now use some of the fundamentals to create more powerful macros. With this video being an introduction to loops, we'll keep moving right ahead. The next loop we'll be covering is the do loop, which will repeat a block of statements while a condition is true or until a condition is true. So there'll be two types of loops, a do while or do until. Now to take a look at a macro that is using a do while loop, we did declare a variable, loop num equals 1, which will be similar to a counter variable, but will be an increment counter, which we'll talk about as it is later in the do while loop. So we can open the loop with the do keyword, and then we can either use while or until, but in this instance we are using while, and then cells with loop num, which is equal to 1 for the row, and column 1 value is not blank. So do while this condition is true, cells loop num, column 1 or row 1 and column 1, font dot strike through, so the properties of those cells will equal true, which will strike through any string in those cells, and then loop num will equal loop num plus 1. So that will be our increment counter. So instead of a counter variable, we are adding on to loop num and then loop, which continues the loop until the cells are blank. So if we take a look at this in Excel with our VBA window pulled up, we can see we have the same exact macro written up here. And so for these type of loops, we will want to make sure that we don't let them run forever. So the condition, the cells equal, do not equal blank is very important. And this is only running through the first column here. But as we can see, we have a bunch of cells, 1 through 21, that have the value not blank in them. So this will start in A1 or cell 11 and move through with the increment counter adding 1 each time. So we'll go through every row in A until we have a cell that is blank, and then that will stop the loop. If we had no cells that were blank in column A at all, this loop would keep running looking for a cell that is blank and would never stop, so we would need to hit escape to end the loop. But now if we run this, we can see it started from cells A1 to A21 and struck through all of the text until it got to 22, and it stopped the loop. So in do loops, the condition is very important to make sure the loop does eventually stop. And so there is another way to write a do while loop. If we take a look at both of these, one has the do while condition right after the do, and right next to it we have a do, and then the statement we want to loop through, and then the keyword loop while. So the loop while is just changing where the while is in the statement, and it will work the exact same. And so now back in Excel, we can see that we changed where the while is. Instead of being after the do, it's now after the loop. And then if we run this, it will be the same results as the while being after the do. So moving on till the do until loop, it is very similar. And if we look here, we can see that the only difference between the conditions while cells will be don't equal, and the until will be equals blank instead of not equals blank. So while that condition or those cells don't equal blank, continue, and then the until will be do this until we hit a cell that is blank. And just like the while, we can put the until after the do, but also at the end of the loop, right after the keyword loop. And back in Excel, we can see that now we have the do until, a cell in the first column or column A equals blank. So now we will loop through this, striking through all of the strings of text in these cells until we have a column or a cell that is blank in this column, starting from A1 down to A22. And so after running it, we can see we get the same exact results, and it just stopped whenever it did meet a cell that was blank, instead of doing it while we had cells that were not blank. And with that, we did cover the for next loop and the do while and do until loops. There are some other loops, the for each, next, and also an until loop or while, when. And I do think I can cover these loops in later videos as we start to run through some different types of macros. So that's all I have for you in today's video. If you enjoyed it, remember to subscribe and hit that like button. And thanks for watching.